The world's elite chess players have gathered in Poland for the Superbet Rapid and Blitz, a thrilling 4-day tournament. The roster includes Indian superstar Praggnanandhaa, French super GMs Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and Alireza Firouzja, Bulgarian legend Veselin Topalov, and many others. Time control 25 minutes for each player, plus 10 seconds added for each move. Day 1 delivered brilliant moves, ugly blunders, phenomenal endgames, and a roller coaster of emotions. Let's dive into the action, starting with round 1, featuring a clash between two of the favorites, MVL and Praggnanandhaa. VL plays white, starts with e4, Praggnanandhaa answers with Sicilian defense c5, we have knight c3, not a very common move in this position, knight c6, bishop b5, knight jumps to the middle of the board to d4, knight develops to f3, e6 for black, castle, in a6 asking the question where the bishop would go. By the way, if you like the content of the channel, please subscribe, leave a comment, and bishop goes to d3. If bishop goes to a4, it would be trapped after b5, bishop b3, exchange of the knights on f3, and c4. Bishop is trapped, white would lose a piece, so therefore bishop goes in the other direction, bishop d3. Pretty ugly position because the pawn on d2 cannot move, and therefore very difficult to develop the bishop on c1. But eventually it's going to be fine for white. Knight goes back to c6 and knight d5. What an epic move. All of a sudden, on move 7, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave sacrifices a piece. And the thing is that it's not very good idea to take that knight, because after e takes d5, e takes d5, knight is under attack, it has to go back somewhere, goes to b4 for example, rook e1 check. The only way to protect the king would be to put a piece there, let's say a bishop, and after d6, white would take the piece back and would have a great position. Therefore, Praggnanandhaa doesn't take the knight on d5 and plays g6. By the way, the best computer move here is really a modern-looking move, g5. Absolutely incredible move, because normally for hundreds or thousands years of chess, moves like g5 would be frowned upon, but computers, engines recently consider this the best move for black in this position. Praggnanandhaa is a human being, he is not a computer, he plays a normal move g6. And the game continues. MVL goes knight e3, bishop g7 goes on a very nice diagonal, c3 blocking at least a little bit the diagonal for that dark square bishop, knight e7, bishop goes to c2, now the plan is clear. Bishop moves back, the pawn is aiming to go to d4, and the bishop from c1 would finally have some openings to go. d5 immediately from Praggnanandhaa, challenging in the center, exchange of the pawns on d5, and d4 for MVL. Exchange of the pawns on d4, castle. The opening stages of the game are over. We have a pretty even position with both players having an isolated pawn on d file, d4 and d5 pawns, and all the pieces are pretty much in good positions. And the game continues with b3. And now dark square bishop for white is aiming to go to b2 or a3, depending on where it would fit better. f5, very aggressive move from Prague. h3, f4, attacking the knight on e3, and knight jumps to g4. Knight f5, putting a pressure on the pawn on d4 with 3 pieces, 2 knights and a bishop. Bishop b2 protects that pawn, so 3 attackers, 3 defenders on the pawn on d4, and knight jumps to h4, challenging the knight on f3. Not the big deal, as knight goes to e5. Bishop takes e5. Normally in this position, I would say that the bishop, the dark square bishop, is very important for black, and it would be more logical to take the knight with the knight. But Praggnanandhaa knows better, he takes it with the bishop, loses a pair, bishop pair, moves the bishop to e6, blocking the pawn on e5. Rook goes to c1, rook f7, rook e1, queen e7, bishop d3, shuffling around of the minor pieces, and now rook g7. And rook g7 is played with the idea to start immediately attacking with the g pawn, g5, g4. Praggnanandhaa is not joking around. Bishop e2. MVL is going a little bit into a passive mode here. Knight takes f3, bishop takes f3, and rook d8 to protect the pawn on d5 as it was attacked by both the queen and the bishop. Bishop d4, and this move actually is interesting because you might think that knight takes d4 and white do not have a bishop pair anymore. But the problem for white is that this dark square bishop is not a very good piece in this position because it's blocked by its own pawn, so it's not really a prize for white, and therefore black do not even take it, do not take the bishop on d4, and instead play a more aggressive move, queen g5, attacking the pawn on h3 because the pawn on g2 is pinned to the king. Bishop b6, attacking the rook, rook goes to d7, bishop c5, d4, and bishop d6. And now, instead of being very passive on a square d4, the bishop is really looking good on a juicy square d6, really creating some problems for black. But it comes with the sacrifice of the pawn on h3. Bishop takes h3. You cannot take the bishop on h3 because the pawn is pinned. Rook takes c6. MVL sacrifices an exchange. Rook takes c6. Computer thinks it's a mistake, but it's not an easy way to understand why, because white is getting a very good position here. After b takes c6, bishop takes c6, white have a pair of absolutely monster bishops and full compensation for a sacrificed exchange. The rook goes back, queen goes to d3. Important to know that the bishop from c6 is protecting the pawn on g2, so there is no checkmate there. And now the bishop on h3 is actually under attack by the queen. Bishop retreats to e6, queen takes a6, and now white have a pair of passing pawns, a2 and b3. And their position, at least from by the naked eye, is looking much better. h5. Pragg is starting attack with another pawn. Queen goes back to d3, rook c8 attacking the bishop, queen e4 protecting that bishop, and f3. I have to mention that queen e4 is a big mistake by white, and after they played this move, Pragg's position instantly became a winning position exactly because of the move f3, which he found pretty much instantly. Both players have 2 minutes and almost 4 minutes on the clock, so they're under time pressure. Queen takes f3, rook f7. Rook activates. It's a very nice piece on f7, and now black are attacking. Bishop d5. Now, if queen just goes away to, let's say, a square e4, we have rook f4, queen has to move away, let's say, to d3, and a rook takes c6. So let's say queen moves to c2, protecting the bishop on c6, and then we have rook g4. And now we have an attack on a pawn on g2, and it's almost impossible to protect because bishop on c6 protecting that pawn is pinned to the queen. So the best move in this position would be f3, and then a rook takes c6, sacrificing the rook, and let's say if queen takes c6, then rook takes g2 with a winning attack, and if queen goes to, let's say, f2 after rook f4, black is simply winning because they have an extra rook. Therefore, in this position, MVL sacrifices the queen and plays bishop d5, which is the best move in this position. His position is still lost, but at least he has chances now. And black have to be very careful how to convert this position. Rook takes f3, bishop takes a6 with a check, king goes to h7, bishop takes c8. And now black plays rook c3. Whew, let's take a look. What's happening here? Crazy position. Rook against rook and two bishops against a queen. And also 5 pawns against 3 pawns. So real material imbalance in this position. Black is much better, but they have to be very careful how to convert this position. Bishop goes to a6, exchange of the rooks, and now again 2 bishops against a queen, 5 pawns against 3 pawns. Not always, not often. Actually, I should say you can see this type of position, especially in the games of grandmasters. Queen c1, pinning the bishop to the king. e6, passing pawn is marching forward. Obviously, black has to do something about it, and they just calmly play king g8, and after e7, king f7. And the king is protecting the protection square e8. g3, d3, using the pin. The bishop cannot take the pawn on d3, and the pawn is just marching forward to become a second queen. White plays king g2, and this is the final mistake of the game, because after queen c8 check, with the next move, Pragg would pick up the bishop on d6, and at this moment, Maxim Vachier-Lagrave resigned, and Pragg started the tournament with a beautiful win. Romanian Grandmaster David Gavrilesku against Bulgarian legend Veselin Topalov, who was world champion at some point in his illustrious career. Romanian Grandmaster starts with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4. We have Scotch defense on the board. Exchange of the pawns, bishop c5. That's a very standard line, and I have to admit I played exactly the same way for black, with queen f6, c3 protecting the knight on d4, knight e7. I feel even better now because this is the position that I have in my games a lot, actually, for black, and Topalov plays the same way, which makes me a little proud. Bishop goes to e2, d6, castle, queen g6, attacking the pawn on e4. But white ignores that attack and plays king h1. And it's not really good idea, not a good idea for black to take the pawn on e4, because white, after knight d2, have a very big advantage of development, and the queen is not really comfortable in the middle of the board. So therefore, it's not a good idea to take the pawn on e4. Instead, Topalov plays knight g4, challenging the bishop on e3. Gavrilesku moves the bishop to f4, and now queen takes e4 for Topalov. The bishop retreats to g3, queen g6, and knight b5. And now the pawn on c7 is under attack, and the fork is coming. So therefore, the pawn has to be protected with a simple move, bishop b6, protecting the pawn. Bishop takes d6. Sacrifice of the bishop, what a move by Gavrilesku. C takes d6, knight takes d6 check. So now black is without a castle, king f8, and knight takes c8. And now, knight takes f2. Forking the knight, the queen, and the king. Rook takes f2. And the problem for black, they cannot take the rook on f2. The reason they cannot take the rook on f2, because they're going to get checkmated on the last rank, queen d8 checkmate. So we have to go back in this position, and after rook takes f2, Topalov takes the knight on c8. But white's position is clearly better, because their king is safe, king on f8 is very weak, f-file is very dangerous for white. After bishop h5 attacking the queen, it turns out that if the queen just moves somewhere, let's say on g5, then after rook takes f7, white has an absolutely winning position. Therefore, in this position, in his colorful and energetic style, full of brilliant moves, Topalov sacrifices the queen and plays bishop takes f2. It's a queen sacrifice, so bishop takes g6, h takes g6. So what do black have for the sacrificed queen? Well, they have a very nice position. They have a rook on h file, which is very active. They have an active bishop. They have a rook and a knight that are ready to jump into the game. White has an extra queen, but their other pieces, the rook and the knight, are not even in the game yet. They're still in the parking lot. So, black have some chances. White have to be careful. Queen f3, attacking the bishop on f2. Bishop moves back, knight goes to d2. White are not even looking at the pawn on b7. The main thing for them right now is to make sure that they develop all their pieces and get them into the game as soon as possible. Knight f5. Interesting point here that if now queen takes b7, then knight g3 simply a checkmate, because the pawn is pinned and the square g1 is protected by the bishop. So therefore the queen cannot really move from protecting the square on g3. Gavrilesku plays g4, attacking the knight, and bishop c7, putting pressure on the pawn on h2 with the rook and the bishop. Knight f1. Now, the best move for white here was, of course, to take the knight on f5. And after, let's say, rook takes h2, simply king g1, and white is basically still winning. Even after rook takes d2, white's position is totally winning. Instead, Gavrilesku preferred a much safer move, which is fine. Knight f1, protecting the pawn on h2. Knight goes to d6, rook e1, g5. So more moves are made in this position. White still have an extra queen. I'm going quickly here because nothing much is happening. Exchange of the rooks on e2, g6, attacking the rook, bishop d8, protecting the rook, c4. You can see here that pretty much the pawns are going to march forward and black really have nothing to do, nothing to oppose that march of the pawns. More moves are going to be made in this game. I'm going quickly because, again, the conversion is pretty clean for white. More pieces are exchanged. The more pieces are exchanged, the better. The easier for white to convert this position into a win. a4, b4, so the passing pawns are moving forward. h3, check, king e7. The king is joining an attack, joining the position, going to the middle of the board, which is always good in endgames. Pawn takes a5, pawn takes a5, and bishop takes a5 for Topalov. That loses a bishop, because queen b5 check, and the bishop is lost, king f8, and the rest of the game. I'm gonna go quickly, because not much is happening. Topalov, in his style, plays till the end. Credit to him. He's trying, he's checking, he's checking. The king moves away, and after more moves, after queen d5, Topalov resigns, and Gavrilesku wins the game. One more game I want to show you from round one, and I want to start with this position, and this game is between Russian Grandmaster Vladimir Fedoseev, who represents Slovenia, and French Grandmaster, actually Iranian Grandmaster representing France, Alireza Firouzja. This is the endgame. Bishop against knight, rook against rook, 3 pawns against 3 pawns. White is much better. The reason they're much better, they have a passing pawn on a5 that's ready to march forward. In order for that to happen, the rook should move away, and that's exactly what Fedoseev does. He plays rook d6. This endgame was absolutely epic, and you should stay around and really see the brilliant defense by Firouzja and how he was able to do at least something, and we'll see if he managed to draw the game or not. But again, he made it almost impossible for white to win. Let's take a look. Let's take a look. Rook h1, the pawn marches forward. Rook a1, protecting the square a7, so the pawn cannot get there so easily. Bishop goes to b3 with the idea to block the rook with the move bishop a4. Not exactly correct move, because after h5, Firouzja actually manages to create his own passing pawn h. Bishop a4, check, king c5. In this position, black had to continue checking white king with rook c1 check. Instead, Alireza makes a big mistake, a blunder, and plays a rook b8. And after that move, his position again is losing. Rook d5, king f6 protecting the knight. White was winning with just moving the pawn to a7, marching forward. Instead, Fedoseev plays bishop c6, and after rook c8, bishop is pinned. Rook d6 check. Now, Firouzja has a choice between moving the king to g5 or e7, and he chooses, with 13 seconds to go and under tremendous pressure, he chooses the wrong move. He plays king e7, which is again losing. After a7, h4, queen, rook takes a8, and bishop takes a8, and we have a position with white having an extra rook, seemingly easily winning the game. But after h takes g3, black all of a sudden have a passing pawn. Rook d1, rook d2, I'm sorry, protecting the square g2 from the pawn moving forward. King goes to f6, and white have a problem here. White's problem is the pawn on e4. It's blocking its own light square bishop, and it's out of the game. And king also is pretty much out of the game as well. So therefore, as of right now, one rook is fighting against a king, a knight, and two pawns. Rook g2, pawn on g3 cannot be protected, so king g5, rook takes g3, king f4, and a rook goes back to g1. Again, knight, king, and the pawn pretty much against the rook. g3. In this position, white had to actually transfer the king to d6, e7, and capture the pawn on f7. That would have been a winning plan. Instead, Fedoseev plays a mistaken move, bishop d5. And after knight f3, rook g2, knight h4 attacking the rook, and repeats of the moves, Fedoseev plays rook c1. He doesn't want to repeat the moves because he still thinks that with an extra rook he is winning this game, but in fact he is not anymore. Firouzja plays g2. His next move is unstoppable. g1 queen. e5. g1 queen, rook takes g1, knight takes g1, and after a couple of moves, kings are on the board, and it's a draw. Absolutely epic save of the game by Alireza Firouzja, playing without a rook at the very end of the game and still managing to draw the game. Round 2, you see the pairings, and we're going to start with the game between Indian superstar Praggnanandhaa and his younger opponent, also from India. And Praggnanandhaa starts with English opening c4, e6, knight c3, d5, d4, standard stuff in the beginning, exchange of the pawns on d5, bishop goes to f4, c6, solidifying the pawn on d5, Praggnanandhaa goes e3, bishop develops to f5, knight e2, knight f6, knight g3 hitting the bishop, bishop goes back to e6, light square bishop for Praggnanandhaa goes to a very nice diagonal on a square d3, castle for black, knight jumps to a very nice square on f5, immediately captured by black. Praggnanandhaa takes it back with the bishop, rook e8, queen b3, attacking the pawn on b7. Pretty much the only way to defend that pawn is queen b6. And it's not advantageous for white to take the queen on b6 because after the exchange of the queens, black have a very active rook on a file A. Therefore, after queen b6, Praggnanandhaa plays queen c2, putting some pressure on the pawn on h7 with the battery of the queen and the bishop. Knight d7, h4, attacking on the king side of the board. Rook goes to d8 and long castle. Again, Praggnanandhaa is not joking around. He wants to attack. c5. His opponent is not afraid at all and plays a very aggressive move, c5, starting his own attack on the queen side of the board. g4 for Praggnanandhaa. He just marches forward. Exchange of the pawns on d4 and bishop b4. Big mistake. Big mistake by Chithambaram, because with the next move, knight a4, Praggnanandhaa was winning the game. Because black pieces are not coordinated at all. Queen is under attack. The queen has to protect the bishop on b4. The only way to do it is queen a5, and after queen a5, the winning move was bishop c7, attacking both the queen and the rook. For whatever reason, with a lot of time left on the clock, Praggnanandhaa didn't see that move, knight a4, and played g5. He continued with his attack on the king side of the board. Exchange of the pawns, of the minor pieces on c3, and knight jumps to e4. f3. Doesn't want to tolerate that knight there even for one move, and Chithambaram sacrifices the knight on c3. Knight takes c3. Great move. White cannot take the knight on c3 because they're going to lose a queen because of this pin. Praggnanandhaa takes on d7. Knight goes to e2. That's a fork. But obviously queen takes e2. And now queen takes d4. Another great move by Chithambaram. He uses the pin. Now, after e takes d4, he takes the queen on e2. So it's an exchange of the queens. And after bishop g4, after all this commotion, we have a position in which white have two bishops for a rook, which is usually much better. But black is fine here, because they have very active rooks, especially the rook on e2. And after rook takes e2, they also have two pawns. Two extra pawns, and not only two extra pawns, but both pawns are connecting passing pawns that could become potentially queens. Also, rook a1 is a threat to win white's rook on a skewer. Rook e1, check, king d2, and now king protects the rook on e1, exchange of the rooks, and rook e8 check, king d2. Now black had to play a5. They just needed to start marching with the pawns on the king side of the board, queen side of the board. Instead, f6. That was too slow. After f6, after exchange of the pawns, bishop f5. Now a5, but a little bit too late. Engine still says this position is even. Bishop c7, a4. Now, bishop d7 is not a good idea, although you would think that this wins a pawn, but no. Rook e7, and black actually would win a bishop. So, Praggnanandhaa plays bishop d6. He blocks the square a3 from any potential movement of this pawn. b5 and bishop a3. Again, the pawns are static. They cannot move. King goes to the middle of the board. Bishop d3 attacking the pawn. Rook g8. And basically what Chithambaram says here, I'm going to give you Praggnanandhaa, I'm going to give you those two pawns, but I'm going to create another passing pawn on the other side of the board. Rook g2 check, king c3, rook f2. Bishop takes the pawn on a4, rook takes the pawn on f3. And king goes to a square c5 to attack the pawn on d5. And therefore, rook f4, for example, in this position, attacking both pawns, was not a good move, because after king c5, the king would take the pawn on d5, and white would have a much better position. Black plays king e6, they activate the king and also protect the pawn on d5, h5, f5, and bishop c1, which is a mistake. Now black actually is a little better. f4, and the pawn is just moving forward. Now the rook attacks the bishop goes to d2, f3, king c3, and a rook h1 to capture the pawn on h5. Bishop e3, not allowing the pawn to move forward. Rook takes h5, and black's position is totally winning. But Praggnanandhaa has other thoughts. King d3, king f5, bishop a4, and king joins the pawn, and now we'll be helping it to move forward. Bishop f2, king h3, with the idea to go to g2, attacking that bishop on f2. More moves are made. King defends the bishop on f2, and the winning move for Chithambaram here was to play rook a6, with the idea to check the king on a3, win the bishop on f2, and Chithambaram almost made that move. If this was a computer game with a mouse, it almost seemed like he didn't get all the way to a square a6. Instead, he played rook b6, which unfortunately for him lost all the advantage, because after bishop takes d5, it turns out that the bishop controls the square b3, and there is no check from there. Not only it controls the square b3, also it attacks the pawn on f3. And black have to go passive. They have to protect that pawn on f3 with rook f6. More moves are made, and the idea here is that white created a passing pawn d, and black's hope is passing pawn h. The engine still says that this is a draw endgame, until black made a blunder and played a rook d8. And that was a crucial mistake of the game, because bishop takes f3 with the check, king h2, and bishop a5. And now black cannot take the pawn on d6, because after bishop c7, they're gonna lose their rook, because it's pinned to the king. Therefore, in this position, rook e8 check, king f2, and black resigned. They resigned because they cannot stop white pawn from promoting. They're gonna give up their rook for the pawn. So let's say h4, d7, and two bishops can easily checkmate the opposing king. So Praggnanandhaa escaped a loss to his other Indian friend, and was able to win this very incredible game. Round 3, you have the pairings, and we're gonna start with Bogdan Daniel Deac, Romanian Grandmaster, against Praggnanandhaa. d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6. We have a standard King's Indian defense, normal variation. This is what has been played for hundreds of years. Bishop e2, all theory so far. Castle, bishop e3, a5, h3, e5, all standard moves. d5, gaining space in the middle of the board, controlling the squares e6, e6. Knight develops in this position through a square a6, possibly going to b4 or c5. Deac plays queen c2, c6, challenging white pawn center. Knight f3, exchange of the pawn on d5, and knight jumps to h5, possibly going to f4. Queen d2, protecting the square f4 from penetrating of the knight. f5, nice move by Praggnanandhaa. He starts an attack. Already f4 is a threat, because the bishop would be trapped. He will have no moves. Bishop takes a6. Would be logical to capture the bishop with the rook, but Praggnanandhaa decides to take it with the pawn, which is also a good idea because now he has an open file B, where the rook would go. Queen d3 and rook b8, immediately attacking the pawn on b2 castle and h6. The file is so important for black in this position that Praggnanandhaa did not even take the pawn on b2, because in that case he would lose the file b2 white, because after rook b1 exchange of the, let's take a look here, let's say rook b2, rook b1, exchange of the rooks. Now white has an open file b and very active position, and Praggnanandhaa decided he doesn't want to go into those variations and plays h6, Queen e2, knight f6, rook b1. f4 was the best move for black. They will be gaining a lot of space and would have a very nice position. But instead, queen e8, a3, and g5. In every game we saw for this first day of the tournament, Praggnanandhaa is playing very aggressive chess. He starts an attack with the pawns on the king side of the board. b4, g4 for Praggnanandhaa. Exchange of the pawns. h takes g4, and now f takes e4, and knight has to go back to h2. Praggnanandhaa is dominating, but not so easy. Queen g6, attacking the pawn on g4 with 3 pieces, the knight, the bishop, and the queen. g5, the pawn cannot be protected, so Deac sacrifices that pawn. And actually, that's a very good sacrifice, because after h takes g5, the queen on g6 is blocked by its own pawn on g5. And white's king is absolutely safe right now. And again, take a look at the clock. 21 seconds to go for Deac. That's been the story of the day for him. 9 minutes, 26 seconds for Praggnanandhaa. But when he is under a time pressure, he actually starts playing a lot better. Exchange of the rooks on b1, and white's position is better. Why it's better? Because every single piece of white's position is actually very active. The queen is good, knight on the bishop on e3 is slicing black's position. The knight is good on c3, the rook is on open file. The only bad piece is the knight on h2. For the black, the bishop, the light square bishop, has to be glued to this pawn in order to protect it. The bishop on g7 is blocked by its own pawns. And the knight on f6 needs some moves to get into a game. King f7. The reason for this move is to move the rook on an open file h. Bishop b8, rook b8, rook goes to an open file h, queen c4, and after queen h5, the knight on h2 is under attack and cannot really be protected. Be careful not to play knight f1, because there is a checkmate in one move. Therefore, Deac takes the bishop on c8, Praggnanandhaa takes the knight on h2, king f1, and black didn't want to exchange the rooks on c8. Instead, they played a rook h4, which was a strange looking move, because now the rook on h4 really don't have many squares to go to. Queen takes a6, queen h1 check, and queen takes g2. Black is fine here, but white's is a little better, because again, it's a very dangerous pawn on a5 that's ready to be promoted to a queen. But king is not so safe. Rook c7 check, king g6. King is pretty much in the middle of the board for black, but it's very safe, because it's protected by the knight, the bishop, and the pawn. Queen takes d6, and a rook h1. And now Deac, again with seconds to go on the clock, makes 3 great moves, and all 3 moves are by the king. King d2, queen f1, king c2, and now all these 3 squares are protected from the checks by the knight and the bishop. Another check from d3, king b2, the 3rd move by the king in a row, and now the square on b1 is protected by the knight and the square on e2 is protected by the knight. And white simply protected their king somehow, and black do not have anything more to attack. Rook h2, king b3, another move by the king. Repeat of the moves just to gain some time on the clock. Queen takes e5, queen takes e3, because the pawn is pinned, you cannot take the queen, but you can take the rook. Check, king b3, e3, another attempt for white to make a mistake, because you cannot take the pawn on e3 because the queen on h2 would be lost. Sacrificing the rook on g7 for Deac, and that was the best way to win this position. King takes g7, check, king g6, and simply taking the pawn on e3. Queen takes e3. White has two extra pawns. Most importantly, pawn on a5 is just marching forward, and nothing is gonna stop it. a6. Knight takes d5. Using the pin, knight on c3 is pinned. But queen d6 check. Knight has to go away to go back to f6, because otherwise queen would take it. King just joins the attack on b4. Queen c5, check, king a5, knight d7, queen d6 check, king h5, knight e4. That was not a very correct move, but it's good enough. After knight e5, white won because black actually lost on time. They didn't manage to make this move on time, but this position is totally winning for white. They would have to be careful, but eventually the pawn a would be promoted to a queen. So Deac, feeling sick in the first day, beats one of the favorites of the tournament, Praggnanandhaa. And last but not least, the game between Maxim Vachier-Lagrave and Veselin Topalov. Veselin Topalov lost previous first two games of the tournament, and let's see what he can do against one of the best players in the world, Maxim Vachier-Lagrave. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6. We have Ruy Lopez, which is, of course, the oldest opening in the world. Knight f6, castle for white, bishop e7, d3, all standard stuff. Bishop goes to b3 after being attacked by the pawn, d6, a3, castle for black, knight c3, rook goes to b8, h3. I'm going quickly here because the opening is very standard and it's been played millions of times in the history of chess. Exchange of the bishops on e6, and knight jumps to a square d5. You cannot take the knight on d5 with the knight, because after pawn takes d5, it's going to be a fork, and black is going to lose a piece. Knight e7, immediately challenging that knight on d5. Topalov doesn't want to tolerate that knight even for one move. Knight takes f6, rook takes f6, and d4. Maxim Vachier-Lagrave is opening the game in the center. Knight g6, queen goes to e2, queen e8, d5, gaining some space. Squares on c6 and e6 are protected by the pawn. White's position maybe slightly better, but obviously pretty even. c6 immediately challenging white center. Rook d1, exchange of the pawns on d5. And bishop goes back to c1. Bishop e7, rook d1, attacking the pawn on d6. Obviously, right now it's protected, but in some future variations, the pawn on d6 is pretty weak, cannot be protected by any other black pawns, so therefore white is gonna put some pressure on it. Bishop d8, very smart maneuver by Topalov. The bishop goes from a very set square on e7, where it had nothing to do, to a very nice diagonal from a square b6. g3, bishop b6, king g2, rook f8. Rook f8 is preparing an attack on the white king with the move f5. So rook f8 first, then rook would be moved to e6 and f5. c3, knight e7 first, attacking the rook, goes back, Now, rook e6 and f5 is coming. g4. Very smart move to protect a square f5 from any attack from Topalov, but Topalov plays f5 anyway. Topalov was never shy in his career to sacrifice, to play on the edge. G takes f5 and knight takes f5. What a move by Topalov, sacrificing a knight. And now if e takes f5, after rook takes f5, e4 is a threat, forking the knight and the rook. And Vishalagraph decided not to even go into this position, which would have been pretty even, actually. And he plays king h1, which turned out to be a pretty big mistake. Not sure what was the plan playing that move, but after knight e7, rook g1, and rook f6, black position is pretty dominant. They're attacking white pieces, and they didn't even have to sacrifice a piece. The material is even. They just have a much better position. Rook g3, protecting the knight on f3 once again. King h7, rook d1, rook f7, h4, queen a8. Well, if you can explain me this move in the comments, I would appreciate that. I have no idea what Topalov meant when he played that move, and actually lost most of his advantage according to the engine. h5, queen e8. So if Topalov wanted to maneuver and transfer his queen to h5, he could have done it from the square c6. He didn't have to move it first to a8. All right, king g2, rook goes to f8. Pretty tricky move, because now the move was with the rook, but the pawn on h5 is under attack by the queen. So rook h1 protecting that, and queen returned to the square c6. So after circling around, returned to the same square it started. That whole maneuver. Rook f7, just to protect the pawn on g7, just in case. Bishop e3, exchange of the bishops on h3, and knight starting to jump around to different, better squares than it was on e7. Queen d3, knight goes to f6, knight d2. Very smart maneuver with the knight for Topalov. And the reason he is playing so easily with one piece right now, because white do not have a plan. They really don't have much to counterplay. f3, and now knight c5. So the knight went from e7 to g8, f6, d7, and now c5, and attacking the queen. Queen moves back to c2, and now knight goes to e6 and is looking to jump into a very nice square on f4. Queen d1, knight f4. So now the knight made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 moves in a row, and black is still very much winning this game because white couldn't do much against it. They didn't have much to offer in terms of a plan, in terms of attack. Knight goes back to e6. Some maneuvering continues here, going a little quicker because not much is happening in this position. Black is still much better. After king g2 computer, the engine shows that black is winning by 5, which is pretty much a resignable position. And after queen a2, Maxim Vashelagraph resign. This is obviously a grandmaster type of resigning, because on a regular level of chess, this game could continue for quite some time, but he realizes what we kind of discussed before. He doesn't have much of a plan. Black's position is so solid that black queen is just starting to devour all the pawns on the queen side of the board, and white cannot do anything about it. So after losing first game of the tournament, Vasilin Topalov won in style against a very strong opponent. 3 rounds, day 1 is behind us. Let's take a look at the standings. We have a sole leader of the tournament, Vladimir Fedoseev, with 5 points out of 6. 2 points for a win, 0 for a loss, and 1 point for a draw. So he won 2 games and drew 1 and has 5 points. Favorites, Firouzja from France and Praggnanandhaa Chithambaram from India have 4 points. Day 2 is tomorrow. If you like the video, I would really appreciate if you subscribe, leave a comment, like it. Thank you for watching.